Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the latest in the Build Back Better / Build Back Fossil Free series. Today, we'll be talking about the recently released report, Workers and Communities in Transition, the report of the Just Transition Listening Project. My name is Michael Leon Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. LNS is a national network of workers, labor unions, and other worker organizations, environmental and climate justice allies. Our mission is to build a movement for a transition that is ecologically sustainable and economically just. We maintain the climate science and goals established by the consensus of climate scientists central to our work, and we work to build bridges between the labor, environmental, and climate justice movements to move together with urgency to meet those goals. We want to start off today's program with some opening remarks from Congressman Andy Levin, representing the 9th District of the state of Michigan. Congressman Levin approaches the climate crisis from a labor perspective, having spent years as a union organizer and having worked at the AFL-CIO before his career as an elected representative. Congressman Levin understands that economic sustainability for workers goes hand in hand with striving for environmental sustainability for the planet. And we're very honored to have you join us today, Congressman Levin. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's amazing to be here with all these powerful activists from all over the country. It really gives me a lot of hope for our just and green future that we're going to build together. You know, I've spent most of my career fighting for clean energy and workers' rights and the nexus of the two. And that experience is just central to what I do as the representative of Michigan's 9th District in Congress. Friends, we cannot tackle the climate crisis without addressing the inequality crisis, the racism crisis, the public health crisis, all these crises that are plaguing our country all at the same time. Our transition to a green future has to be joined and to all these issues, and it's got to be a just transition centered around workers and communities, and especially those most impacted by the climate crisis and all these overlapping issues. Unless we give workers in the fossil fuel industries, the coal, other industries, and frontline communities a seat at the center of the table, I'm not talking about window dressing, but I'm talking about as real valued partners in this work, we are simply not going to achieve the profound and rapid change we absolutely need. And it's important to recognize that we have a long history of unjust transitions. For far too long, we've allowed systemic racism, colonialism, classism, sexism, and more to dictate and drive our policymaking. We cannot allow those systems of oppression to succeed as we tackle the climate crisis. It won't just be unjust, it won't work. We won't get it done. We will not tackle climate change successfully if we leave whole communities out of the effort. Take my EV Freedom Act or Electric Vehicle Freedom Act, a proposal to create a comprehensive national network of high-speed electric vehicle chargers along our whole national highway system within 5 years. I'm not just talking about the interstates, I'm talking about the whole highway system. So you can get in an EV anywhere and drive anywhere else in the whole US without worrying about running out of juice. The whole lower 48, but Alaska and Hawaii too. The EV Freedom Act will help secure the automotive and infrastructure jobs of the future with robust Buy American and prevailing wage requirements to protect hardworking Americans so we can build a future in which every car on the road is an electric one built here in the United States by unionized workers. And the bill makes clear that we have to put opportunities for and the needs of frontline and vulnerable communities first. So I'm talking about thousands and thousands of IBEW jobs to build out the charging infrastructure, thousands and thousands of utility worker jobs to build the substations needed to power all those chargers, and not to mention the auto jobs. We've got to do everything in that way. We've got this incredible moment of transition where we must change course. We've got to make it easier for workers to bargain collectively. We've got to ensure that frontline communities are priority. We've got to make sure that wealth among the many and not the few, and the protection of our one precious earth are all considered in our policy decisions, in every single one of them. But to get this done, we as policymakers have to begin by listening to our communities and our workers, uplifting our communities and our workers who are on the front lines, and calling on us to act and act now and make good on our promises to build back better, not in 10 or 20 years down the road when it's too late. It's already too late. So let's get going. Let's do it right now in a way that builds a just, beautiful world for all of our people in all their incredible and beautiful diversity. I'm with you, ready to go. In addition to the EV Freedom Act, I just introduced with Senator Warren the Build Green Act, also with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a partner in a lot of what I do. And I'm just totally on board with the priorities of the Thrive agenda and the larger Green New Deal that all my legislation is a part of. And let me close by thanking the Labor Network for Sustainability and this Just Transition Listening Project. It's such a great idea. You did such a great job putting this together. I really look forward to hearing about this report. And thanks for all the organizing you're doing to tackle all of our problems and do so in a way that lifts up our communities who've suffered long. And as we were saying before we started, not just our diverse communities in this country, but all the communities throughout the world in the global South that didn't do very much to contribute to the buildup of greenhouse gases, but are bearing the brunt of the problems they're causing. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Congressman Levin, for providing such a great framework for today's conversation. I think it's a terrific context that you laid out for us to move forward. So before we go ahead, I wanted to share a few logistical notes. First, we will be recording this session and plan to make it available on our website. The question and answer period will not be made public, however. We want to make sure that you all feel comfortable making any remarks or questions during that time. The question and answer period will also be reserved for members of Congress and the Senate or congressional staff. There are a number of guests that are joining us today, and we really appreciate you being here, but we want to make sure that the policymakers are given the time to participate. We will take stack via the Q&A function of Zoom or the chat box. We have a team that's monitoring that, and we'll be forwarding those to me. And when you're called upon, we will make you a panelist so you can speak and address and ask your question directly. Please be sure to turn on your video, unmute yourself, and introduce yourself when you speak. I'll remind you of that as we go through that process. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. And again, thank you to Congressman Andy Levin for kicking off today's event. The Just Transition Listening Project was a year-long project that involved many people, including an organizing committee of several colleagues in the labor, climate, and environmental justice movements, a research team of scholars from 4 universities, an advisory committee of labor leaders, as well as the board of directors and staff of the Labor Network for Sustainability. The project, however, was centered around over 100 people who were willing to share their personal histories and experiences, who have lived through economic transitions. Their stories really inspired us and opened our eyes to the challenges they had to overcome, the ways that they organized to support their families, co-workers, and communities, and their ideas to assure that workers and communities are treated as leaders and not as stranded assets in the future. We hope that the project and the report, Workers and Communities in Transition, can provide new and important insights to shape economic transition policies and programs. I want to acknowledge the authors of the report, Dr. Vivian Price, Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies from the California State University, Dominguez Hills, Demetrius Davis, who's a professor of political science and Center for Environmental Justice at Colorado State University, Dr. Todd E. Vachon from Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations, Jeremy Brecker, who wrote the introduction and is a co-founder and senior strategic advisor to LNS, and Maria Brescia Weiler, who contributed to the research and analysis of the report. And lastly, Dr. J. Mijin Cha, who's an assistant professor of urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. Dr. Cha is also a fellow at the Worker Institute at Cornell University. Her research includes labor and climate coalitions, climate justice, and just transitions. And I will now turn the program over to Dr. Cha to present the findings and recommendations of the report. Thank you, Mijin, for being here with us.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and I apologize for any technical glitches. You would think after a year of being online, I'd be better. Ah, perfect. Okay, great. So thank you again, Michael, and thank you all for joining in today. My name is Mijin Cha, and I'm here on behalf of the research team, as Michael mentioned, Vivian Price, Dimitris Divas, Todd Vishon, and Maria Brescher-Weiler. And I really want to give a special thank you to the Labor Network for Sustainability for convening this briefing and also this project. So just a little background on and context for this project. So we know that we will face an energy transition because the way that we'd stop the worst impacts of climate change is to stop using fossil fuels. But we also know that as we stop using fossil fuels, that there will be disruption and displacement. Not that this means that we should not, of course, transition, but just to understand that we have to mitigate this displacement and disruption. And also now we are in a post-pandemic transition, right? So understanding what workers and communities need is vital to transitioning them. And we are really centering what workers and communities needs in this effort. As Michael mentioned, there were over 100 interviews conducted across the country, a combination of one-on-one interviews and focus groups. Once the interviews were conducted, the research team engaged in a rigorous analysis of interviews, and the results are presented in the report that is in the chat. And the report is in 3 sections, and we're just doing a brief, really high-level findings and analysis of the reports, but I would really encourage you to read the entire thing. The first section of the report looks at what we call the problem, and that is the challenges and problems that come from transition that workers and communities face. The second section of the report looks at process, and here we divide between process and how people come together. The first section looks at how labor comes together, and the second section looks at how diverse coalitions, including labor, including indigenous advocacy, environmental justice and climate justice, and community groups come together. And the third section of the report looks at what we call pathways. So what are policies and practices that can help advance a just transition? So amongst our findings, the first is that transition is constant and inevitable. The energy transition is not the first transition that we will face. From deindustrialization to automation, transition is constant and inevitable. And the point that I really want to focus on here, though, is that past transitions have unnecessarily been unjust. And what this means is that transition in and of itself is not unjust, but our reaction to the transition, our inability to support workers and communities, that's why our past transitions have largely been unjust. The second major finding is that transition efforts must begin long before any kind of shutdown or displacement. Once a factory or oil drill or oil site or whatever has shut down, it's too late. Workers need time to transition. Retraining, placing them in new jobs takes time. Economic diversification, bringing in new tax revenue, this all takes time. And in fact, we're already seeing displacements in the fossil fuel industry, so we're already behind in terms of the energy transition. So we really need to begin now to really make sure that the transitions are not unjust. The next finding is that, workers and unions are not a monolith. We hear a lot about how fossil fuel workers and unions are against the energy transition. And what we find is that, it's much more complicated. First of all, workers are community members that care about things like climate change, but their material concern in terms of what will happen to them as we transition is very real, right? Like we have a long history of unjust transition. And also the jobs that are, coming up in the renewable energy sector are not good jobs. They don't pay well, they're not unionized. So the material concern about what happens to workers as they lose their jobs is very real. But the idea that they are, fundamentally opposed to climate, that they don't care about climate change, that they don't care about any kind of issues of like racial justice, economic justice, that's just not true. The next major finding is that efforts that begin from the ground up and center directly impacted stakeholders are the most successful. This is true for a couple of reasons. One, the people that face transition and that have gone through transition know what they need to be supported better than anybody. The second point is that, as you bring people together, as you kind of engage in ground up efforts, you start to build the power necessary to really advance policies and practices. So beginning from the ground up and centering directly impacted stakeholders is really fundamental to a just transition. And finally, just transition requires breadth and depth. So for instance, just focusing on fossil fuel workers, that is not a just transition. And as this example highlights, economic diversification must be robust and expand beyond the energy transition to include those who have been historically excluded. Also with depth, again, understanding that workers are more than just their job, ensuring that we are supporting them holistically. So mental health supports, healthcare, pensions, those things, more than just the job. And those findings then lead to our recommendations. So the underlying kind of ethos of the recommendations that we need to go big, go wide, and go far. So go big really refers to scale. As Congressman Levin talked about, we need something that's really ambitious and a large scale along the lines of the Green New Deal. We have moved past the point where incremental changes are going to address the challenges that we are facing. Also, we need to ensure that those large-scale projects, the large-scale infrastructure projects, they also create jobs geographically everywhere. And this is really important because what we're seeing is that, a lot of renewable energy jobs are being created in places like California, but the fossil fuel jobs that are being lost in places like Kentucky, Texas, Louisiana. So large-scale projects, ambitious projects will ensure that there is not only robust job creation, but that there is geographic disbursement of this job creation. The second go wide is really about scope again. So understanding that workers and communities are more than just their jobs. So ensuring that there's a lot of trauma that comes from displacement that has to be addressed as we think about transition programs. Understanding that communities also, right? So expanding the scope of transition projects, transition ideas, and also ensuring that they're ecologically just. So scope is really making sure that workers, communities, and the climate are made whole. And the go far really focuses on, we really need to be both focused on the future and also proactive. So this means that we're thinking of transition plans, not just in 1 to 2 year timelines, but in terms of tens of years, decades, generations. It takes time to really, rehabilitate these communities and workforces. It takes time to seed new industries. So we really need to move past like short-term thinking to really think about what does a just transition look like in a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year timescale. The second point is that we don't have to start from scratch. We can build and expand on existing programs. So for example, the Trade Adjustment Act came about in the late 1960s to help with workers that were being displaced from globalization and deindustrialization. The Trade Adjustment Act had limited success because the program was, especially initially, was too narrow. The criteria to qualify was too strict, and funding has been really up and down. So these are things that can be fixed. We could expand the Trade Adjustment Act to include climate displacement, and we can ensure that assistance is robust. So part of the problem with the TAA is that it has to be continually reauthorized, and we want to remove as much of this from the political fight as possible, which leads to the next recommendation, which is dedicated and robust funding with polluter pays principles. So again, we want to make sure that we have consistent funding that's robust, that will ensure that we can help seed these new industries and we can really fully transition workers. But the polluter pays principle is also equally important, right? We have for too long engaged in practices where gains are privatized and losses are socialized, right? We as a society pay for the pollution, and the profit that comes from the activity is really concentrated amongst the industries and companies. This has to end, right? And even now, when we see that fossil fuel workers are being displaced, still executives and companies are making profits. We need to shift to socialize gains and privatize losses. So people who have created this situation and created this pollution must be the ones that are financially responsible for the cleanup. We need to strengthen and expand worker protections and strengthen our safety net. There are two things that we can do immediately, which is pass the PRO Act, which would help workers unionize, and pass Medicare for all. Workers unionizing is really important. Unions may not necessarily be able to stop displacements, but workers are much better taken care of if they can negotiate with a union as in the wake of displacements. And Medicare for all, I just cannot stress how important this is. One, we're in a global pandemic, so everybody, I'm sure, understands the importance of healthcare. But also, we are in a global pandemic, which meant that people who had employer-sponsored healthcare, when they lost their jobs, they also lost their healthcare. And also, as people negotiate transition packages, so much time and space is taken up with healthcare that if we actually remove that and everybody just had healthcare as a right, then they could negotiate for bigger and other provisions that would actually help transition more holistically. And also, we need to continue relief as people recover from the pandemic. The last relief package was a great start. It was a great effort, but the economic recovery will take some time, and people will still need help and assistance as we recover from this pandemic. And the final point is that we need to implement just transition infrastructure. This could look like something like a Federal Office of Just Transition, which would help coordinate agency activity, would help, kind of streamline processes, consolidate funding resources. Just transition will require multiple agencies, and ensuring that is coordinated will also help state and local efforts, as state and local officials and advocates have a place where they can go for just transition assistance. So thank you, everyone. That's just a really brief overview of our report findings and recommendations. I'm happy to answer questions along with the rest of the research team. And thank you again for having me today.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Mi-Jin Cha, for presenting the findings and recommendations from the report. Before we go any further, I want to do two other things. First of all, just to recognize all of you that have joined us today. We won't have the opportunity to do introductions, so we encourage you to, in the chat box, just write in your name, where you're zooming in from, and your affiliation. So if you could please do that for us. And second, I also want to acknowledge the sponsors of the Build Back Better, Build Back Fossil Free series, sponsors of this event. That includes 350.org, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Climate Justice Alliance, Friends of the Earth US, Food and Water Action, Indigenous Environmental Network, the Labor Network for Sustainability, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Oil Change International, or Oil Change US, and Progressive Democrats of America, and 0 Hours. So thank you all to all the sponsors of this series for helping to make this event possible. So next, we are going to hear from some of the people that really inspired us through the interviews that we conducted through the Just Transition Listening Project. And we really appreciate all of them taking the time to speak with us today. The first is Charlie Sandoval. He's from Long Beach, California. He's a field operator at the Marathon Petroleum Refinery in Carson, California. He's also a vice president of his union and chair of the Next Generation Committee of the United Steelworkers Local 675. Charlie, thanks so much for joining us. I know this is the middle of the night for you. Charlie's working the graveyard shift. So really appreciate you taking the opportunity to talk with us today and tell your story. So I will turn it over to you next.
Thank you. And yeah, it does feel like 2 a.m. right now for me. So bear with me. I might stumble a little bit, but so my name is Charlie Sandoval. Like you said, I'm a United Steelworker. I live in Gardena, California, which is just about 8 miles away from my work site. I've been working there for 5 years, but overall I have about 10 years of experience, and definitely have high hopes that I'm going to retire from that location. As a union member, I serve as a vice president of my local, and as VP, my mission is to represent all of our forgotten essential workers that through the midst of the pandemic have kept working and ensuring that our nation continues to move. My functions as a trainer consist of providing excessive training to our operators and helping them understand the intricacies of the unit functions, helping them implement and manage safety protocols, and overall be a trusted resource when it comes to troubleshooting and support. This union job is important to me because this has helped me achieve my American dream. I'm a child of immigrant parents, college educated, and of humble beginnings. Growing up in South LA, job opportunities were very limited and still are. You can find a job, but not a job with a livable wage. My career is more than a job. It has given me the opportunity to advance myself and attain many milestones, like helping my family come out of poverty, pay off my student loans, and become a homeowner. In addition to that, it has allowed me the opportunity to give back to my community by locally investing and not having to find a job outside the Los Angeles region and be displaced by gentrification. It has allowed me to build a community within the limits of the refinery with other like-minded individuals like myself. 73% of my union represented coworkers are people of color who live along the fence line. I think we should have a clean environment and can achieve it by working together with labor so we can methodically help in the development of a new technology that we can phase in without disrupting the livelihood of many workers. If change is coming, we need a just transition, not just in transition, where the worker's voice is being heard. We panic when we hear the words close, shut down, and eliminate, because the fact of the matter is that we really don't have a concrete solid plan right now. Everything seems to be a wish list. Life in California right now is very tough. We're the epicenter of homelessness nationwide. We cannot afford any more job loss. California represents about 27% of the nation's homeless population. That is why we have to be very careful that we create new opportunities and not add to the California crisis. We, the workers, will not settle for anything less. We do not want to settle for a quick 9-month training program that would have us installing solar panels for minimum wage, no pension, and no benefits. We will not fall for any dangling carrots or empty promises. The math to us doesn't make sense. We've talked this with our union members over and over. Currently, the average wage is $80,000 to $120,000 a year. To a $40,000 job, it doesn't make sense to us. We're concerned and scared that the planning is happening and the impact of the workers are not really being heard. So we really want to make sure that we're heard. Before we continue on a conversation, there's a couple of questions that I've been posing different groups, and I'd like to pose this group. If there is a transition, who will fund the new infrastructure change? Are there any investors that have come out, or is the government going to pay for it, or is the taxpayer going to pay for it? In the last couple of years, unions have lost so much power due to management-sided regulations. Will these future companies that come out of the workforce be able to allow us to unionize, or are they gonna say they are and then don't? We're currently seeing the fight that Amazon is putting against our brothers and sisters in Alabama. The #2 company of the Fortune 500 list is pushing against unions. Let me repeat again. I can't even understand how the #2 company, one of the richest companies in the world, is pushing against unions to try to improve the lives of these workers. So that in itself makes us worried. Another example is Tesla. We hear about companies like Tesla that are changing technology, but they're not even union. They don't want to unionize. Sorry. So in talking to our members, we've come out with a couple of lists of things that we think is a just transition. So a just transition for us looks like the following. One, the jobs that come out have to be like in kind with respect to job duties. They have to be very similar. So we would like somebody to do an analysis of what we do in the refinery and how we can transition to another job. Two, we want comparable pay and benefits. Three, union tenure. We don't want to go to another union where our tenure is not going to be respected. We want to be able to transition that. Four, if there's a wage change, let there be some type of wage gap insurance. Five, protection of our pensions and 401ks. And six, similar health benefits. Let's be realistic. It's easy to have a vision, but the implementation is always a challenge. We must work together to realize a reasonable and equitable transition that will be a win-win for all. I do want to thank you all for allowing me to present myself with you. I've worked with a lot of these groups, and thanks for allowing me to voice my opinion. Not my opinion, but also the voices of our workers. Again, my name is Charlie Sandoval, and I'm a proud union worker, and sorry that it feels like 2 a.m. right now for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Doesn't sound like 2 a.m. I really appreciate you taking the time again, and we know you got another shift coming up pretty soon, so really appreciate you again taking the time. So next, we have Ashley Nicole McCrae. Ashley is a member of the absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, a descendant of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and a lifelong Oklahoman. Ashley works as the Green New Deal organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network and organizes on behalf of tribal and climate issues in Oklahoma. She currently resides on the Muskogee Creek Reservation, I hope I pronounced that right, commonly known as Tulsa, Oklahoma. So Ashley, thank you also for taking the time to be with us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. And thank you everybody who's in attendance to hear about this really important project. I want to share a little bit with you about my experience living in Oklahoma as an Indigenous woman and as someone who really cares about making sure that our environment is here for future generations. And so I know many of you may know or may not know that Oklahoma really is an oil dependent state. Really, it's predicated on the founding of oil and the removal of tribal nations. My tribal nation was one of many nations, 35 nations, who were forcibly removed from the East Coast during Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies and forced into what is now known as Oklahoma. Now, of course, we were promised by treaty rights that that land would be left alone, that we wouldn't have to worry about further colonization. But as soon as oil was discovered, everything was out the window. And so, that's when the land run happened. And many of us were, again, forcibly removed off of our lands. And so really, you know, what we see here in Oklahoma, because it is a singular economy that is so oil dependent, many of our people, including our tribal nations, are forced into these jobs. My own father, he actually had to drop out of 8th grade because his family is so poor, and he became a roughneck in the oil industry, and he actually retired out of the oil industry just recently. And so, you know I know exactly what it looks like to be forced into a singular economy, because you absolutely have to take care of your families, you have to take care of your communities, and you have to provide those life-sustaining necessities to make sure that we can survive. And so what happens here in Oklahoma, oftentimes we see that our tribal lands and our tribal people are being exploited by the oil and gas industry. What we see, for instance, they're coming into our tribal newsletters, you know, just scouting for people to work on pipelines. And they're also, you know, knocking on our doors, asking us to lease our lands out for their fracking projects. And so really we're put in such a bad situation because we are so impoverished. We need these jobs, we need that money from those leases. And really it's just shown, you know, why we need a just transition. And I think even more, you know, spectacular or really, you know, just shocking, quite frankly, was the beginning of the pandemic, and really seeing so many oil workers losing their jobs. Part of my job requires me to, you know, keep track of what's happening in the oil industry here in our state. And what we see every day on one of our main media sites for oil is, you know, so many workers losing their jobs, you know, this company tanking, this company going bankrupt. And what we're seeing is that there's no transition, there's no equitable jobs that can, you know, really fill that gap for our people. And so we're left with, you know, trying to piece together what little we can to make sure that we can make sure our families survive. Another story that I would like to share with you, several years ago in 2017, I was actually working on the ground. I lived in a camp for five months in Southeast Oklahoma fighting the Diamond Pipeline. And what we see here in Oklahoma, because of regulatory rollbacks, many of the projects that are going through our state are actually not benefiting our state in any way, shape, or form. We're really just opening the doors so these pipelines can run through to carry tar sands down to the Gulf Coast. And our people are not even able to get jobs on those very pipelines. And so one of the folks that I met while advocating against the Diamond Pipeline in Oklahoma was actually a pipeline union person, a pipeline worker who I was surprised to meet him. But he showed up to one of our listening sessions, one of our town halls, to really just express his frustration that he couldn't even get a job on the very pipeline that was going through his own backyard, because these jobs are outsourced to other states and they bring in outside labor into our communities. And so the reality is that, you know, we're not losing jobs when these companies come or pull out, because we never had them in the first place. And so we're seeing really here on one hand a loss of jobs in the oil industry because of the pandemic, because of the ebbs and flows of the market, and because these jobs just really are not sustainable anymore. And then on the other hand, we're seeing that the people who are trying to get jobs on these very projects can't do that because Oklahoma has just really been pushed into a situation where we're just serving as the land for these projects to go through. And so, you know, I really think that these many issues, especially the recent winter storms that really hit Oklahoma and Texas and the South so hard, really show the failures of the oil and gas industry. And because that really is the only economy that our people can rely on for a stable job and a stable income, which really we know is not actually a stable job or income, because oftentimes you're just moving. My dad would have to often move from job to job to job, just to make sure that we had enough to survive. And so, you know, I think that all of these recent crises are really just demonstrating the need for a just transition. And we need one so desperately, because we don't have anything filling in the gaps of what the oil economy has done to our state. We need jobs that, you know, offer the sort of funding and money for our people so that we can actually provide for our families. And we also need the skills necessary to work those jobs sufficiently. And so, I'm just really happy to be here today to share my story about being an Indigenous woman living in an oil dependent state. And I just really, want to impress the need for this just transition. So Niawe, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Really appreciate getting your perspective, and thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. Our last presenter today is Robert Bauer. He's the Assistant to the President for Workforce Development Programs for the Massachusetts AFL-CIO and Senior Political Strategist at Community Labor United. He was Vice President of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 1505 and has since been with the Massachusetts AFL-CIO for over 20 years. Mr. Bauer ran the Rapid Response Program for the Massachusetts AFL-CIO, which you'll hear more about. And during that time, he revolutionized the program, assisting dislocated workers in overcoming layoffs, accessing career services, and finding hope during tough times. Mr. Bauer has served as political director and oversees the Education and Training Department at the Massachusetts AFL-CIO, which covers the Rapid Response Team and the Workforce Development staff. So Bob, thank you so much again for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to present.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank LNS for pulling these meetings together and for your leadership over the last several years. Before I get started, though, I definitely just wanted to say on behalf of President Tolman and the Massachusetts AFL-CIO and the 500,000 families that we represent here in Massachusetts, we cannot thank the congressional delegation and the staff enough. You are heroes to all of us. To be able to stand up in that siege on the Capitol and still make sure democracy happened, and then come right back and pass the American Recovery Act. And this is one of the biggest, boldest votes. I just got off the phone with Congressman McGovern, chairman of Rules Committee, and he mentioned what it was like down there and how proud he is after being there since 1996 to be able to take such a vote that not only helped workers' pensions, healthcare, COVID, the vaccines, transportation, and everything else that was in that package was probably something I've never seen in my 40 years as a union member. But I'm so proud of all of you for doing the right thing, being big, being bold, and taking on this challenge. And I think there's going to be a lot happening in the next several years. Also, it'd be remiss if I didn't thank Congressman Levin for his leadership. Not just as a congressman, but as a union leader and as a community activist. I mean, he saw enough job loss in Michigan years ago when he put together the Future of Work and some of the other programs. He knew the No Worker Left Behind program was not just about no worker left behind, but no community left behind. Because we all know whenever there's a plant closing or a layoff, it affects everybody in the community, not just the workers being laid off. We've been in Massachusetts has been working hard on this just transition as well. We've been doing some work. We're part of the New England for offshore wind. We've been working on some geothermal projects up in the Merrimack Valley. We've got a couple of microgrid projects for communities, low-income communities in the Boston, Chinatown area. And we've been working with a lot of trades and unions to learn more with our environmental and community groups. And it's been a pleasure working with LNS and some of the other community and environmental groups that have been teaching us a lot about this stuff. But to my brothers and sisters, Ashley and Charlie, who just spoke, it's true. When you lose your jobs and there is no transition, it's hard. The best just transition you can have is to have a union card in your pocket. In Massachusetts, we've closed a lot of plants over the last several years. And because we buy a lot of hydropower from Canada, we've closed 2 nuclear power plants recently, and we've closed several fossil fuel plants, and we were able to get all of those workers trade certification. In Massachusetts, the maximum you can collect for unemployment is $855 a week. You can work part-time and collect benefits. You get up to 1/3 of your average weekly wage, is $25 per dependent child. So there is enough of a safety net so that when you are on trade adjustment assistance, that you'd be able to continue to go to school, get retrained. And for folks, most folks on the call probably know what the trade adjustment assistance is. It gives you up to 2 years worth of unemployment. It gives remedial education as well as relocation expenses. And for older workers, there's a transition time up to 2 years that they can supplement some income. So what we did in Massachusetts, we filed 2 pieces of legislation. One is the Just Transition Act, and that will create a Just Transition Department as well as a Just Transition Advisory Committee in that department that comes under the Secretary of Labor's office. And we've also changed in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. We're calling it the Climate Adjustment Assistance Program. And we're putting a funding stream together where we're trying to make sure in Massachusetts, anyone who loses their jobs because of climate or new technologies in this sector would be eligible for those benefits. We also know that in order to have a just transition, we need to make sure that these jobs have worker standards. So we filed the Clean Energy Workforce Standards Accountability Act, which makes sure that there's a level playing field, that there will be prevailing wage in these jobs, that there will be a pathway towards at least talk towards a project labor agreement, and that there will be apprenticeship utilization. So those are some of the programs that we're working with. But over the years, we've had so many plant closings and layoffs, and many of our members understand that, in the manufacturing industry and the stitching industry, that when you lose your jobs, if you do get those trade benefits, it's good. And I know that down in Washington, I know Andy's been working in the past with several of our partners, and we've had a group called the National Call to Action, where we worked with the congressional delegation, and we've worked with the Department of Labor to make sure these programs were funded. In the past, under the Clinton administration, they were able to put money into programs like these labor programs all over the country. And then we were able to share best practices and ideas like Andy had in Detroit, ideas like other people had in Pennsylvania, Tom Croft with the Steel Valley Authority, ideas that we could share, that we could help workers in communities that were going through these transitions. And over the last several years with this Trump administration especially, they've reduced the Department of Labor down to nothing. And a lot of these programs across the country have been devastated. We're down to 2 people, 1.5 really, when we used to have about 7 or 8 staff. And most of the programs in the country that I've dealt with have disappeared because of funding. It'd be great to be able to have those eyes and ears back out there, making sure that they were keeping an eye on what's happening around transition and sharing these ideas so that we can all work together around this. The other thing somebody mentioned earlier about the warn notice, not having enough time. The other thing would be nice to see Congress change the warn notice to 90 days around these climate jobs, so it would give you a little bit more time to transition around that stuff as well. Last, I think the important thing is that we're going to need to have transparency. I did talk with Congressman Neal recently, Chair of Ways and Means, who mentioned that this big infrastructure bill that they're going to be coming out with, they want to be big and bold on it. And they know it's not the same economy from the 2008 recession that we were in, that we will be needing to make sure this pandemic has really shined a light on the racial, social, and climate injustice that's happened all over this country for many, many, many years. Andy mentioned that at the beginning of his presentation. And, Congressman Neal said what they're going to try to do is put together a large pool of money that's going to be put aside to help reemploy and retrain workers who've lost their jobs and may never get to go back to their jobs, especially in low-income communities and communities of color who has been hit the most. So I think what we're going to need to make sure is, and I know I'm very proud of our delegation here in Massachusetts, they are holding our governor accountable for this federal money that's coming in, making sure there's transparency, making sure that they report back to our delegation what they're spending that money on. And I think that's going to be something that's important to make sure that if we're going to be big and bold and do the right things for the American public, we're going to need to make sure there's transparency around the money that's coming in, and make sure it's going to the people that need it the most. And again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words today, and I appreciate being on with all of you guys.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Let's open it up. We still have about 15 minutes left in our hour. Wanted to see if there are any questions from folks. And again, we want to prioritize questions from folks from the congressional offices. So if you just want to get on Stack through the chat box or in the Q&A function, I'll call on you, and then we'll let you ask your question. So anybody want to start it off? And you're getting requests for links there, Bob, in the chat box, by the way. Okay.
Mike Kavanaugh has the two bills that we filed. If he wants to share those, I don't think I can share them on the screen. But if Mike or somebody could make sure that people can get those, that'd be great.
All right. Well, so let me ask a follow-up question. I see one of the authors, Vivian Price, did raise a question. Maybe Charlie, if you want to speak to this one first. So how do we make sure that solar or wind projects don't duplicate the pattern of oil companies, just take the land and offer low-paid short-term jobs?
Well, that's kind of our concern, right? That it just not on any company that, you know, comes with new technology that wants to replace, you know, existing fossil fuels. I think that the key would be that government backs unions, and obviously unions unite, and we make sure that before any project gets developed, you know, unions are a priority, so this doesn't happen. So we're able to develop great, good contracts, you know, where the worker is taken care of.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Bob, I'd also like if you could say a little bit about the rapid response team, because I thought that was one of the most important and interesting things that we found coming out of the project. So if you could just say a little bit about that program, that would be great.
Yeah, the rapid response team is what we have. We're part of the state team, and we work closely with state partners all over the state. Whenever there's a plant closing or a layoff, I will reach out to the union. The state reaches out to the company. We try to get everybody at the table, and we start out with employee meetings. We start out with doing the employee meetings and make sure that workers know about unemployment, retraining opportunities, about the trade program if they're trade eligible. We also set up meetings where we'll do peer counselors if necessary, if we have a long enough time that we can. The first thing we try to do, and I know Andy was part of this when we did it with Elizabeth Warren, when they did the WIOA reauthorization, we made sure that money is available to do layoff aversion. So we never go in there with the idea that we're going to close down a plant. We go in there that we're going to try to save the plant. And, 9 out of 10 times we're not able to save the plant, but a lot of times we're able to minimize the layoffs. And we minimize the layoffs by getting in there early, doing resumes, holding workshops. When we closed the nuclear power plant, Plymouth Power Plant down in Plymouth, Mass, the union was unbelievable. They negotiated a severance package. They got a year's worth of severance. These workers were probably making over $150,000 a year. They got a year's severance package. They got a 1 week pay for every year of service. They were able to get 6 months worth of medical insurance. And because we were able to get them trade certified, they were able to get up to 2 years worth of benefits, unemployment benefits, and get retrained and relocated. And many of those get relocated. But the best part of it was that the utility workers brought in their other companies who hired a lot of the younger people that were in the facility. Some of the older workers wanted to transition to another nuclear power plant in another part of the country so they could get their last 2 or 3 years in. But many of these younger workers transition to the new jobs in the electric field or the gas field. But they all understand that they're going to be losing jobs down the road. They know it. They want to be at the table. The Attorney General here in Massachusetts just put together an advisory committee around this just transition, and we put on utility steel workers, laborers, plumbers, pipe fitters, and the AFL to be part of that as well. But the earlier we can get in, and what we try to do is have in each part of the state, we used to have, when we had more staff, one part-time person in every labor council who was our eyes and ears in those regions. So when they heard there was something happening in a plant or something that maybe overtime stopped, things were slowing down, we would be prepared and try to find out, can we get in there early and try to help save those facilities, you know?
Thank you, Bob. Okay, now we got a couple of questions in the question and answer. I'm going to start with the second one here for Ashley, so we can bring her back into the conversation. It says, Ashley, what sort of legislation do you and people you work with wish that Congress would pass, especially in addressing the intersection of Indigenous peoples and the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really important. So and I think this also kind of touches on the other issue about just taking the land. One of the things that we're really trying to advocate and advance here at Indigenous Environmental Network is the codification of free, prior, informed consent. This is something that will help, and it's very similar to what's happening with pipelines. We're seeing that, you know, companies are saying that they're consulting with our tribal nations, but that's not really happening. They're just checking boxes and calling it good. And I know that the Biden administration put forward a memo around meaningful consultation, but what we're saying is free, prior, informed consent. Make sure that our communities are brought into the process from the very beginning, and they are part and partial to any decisions that impact our lands or our communities. And so this is something that would really help address a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in our communities, which is really around loss of voice, loss of consent, or lack of consent, or lack of even, you know, the meaningful consultation that Biden administration is trying to say that we're working toward.
Great, thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Colin from Congressman McGovern's office for that question. This may be a good closing question maybe for all of you, but strong just transition provisions are of course not common enough in existing legislation. Do you have favorite existing bills you would point to that have been introduced already? And thank you, Saul Levin, for that question.
I'll start. No, I don't have anything that I favor right now. For me, everything seems to be a little bit more generic, and as far as it goes, is usually like a 2-year plan. You know, it's not enough for us. You know, we're not looking for a hand-me-down from anyone. You know, we just want to continue working. You know, and you know, if we can avoid any kind of disruption, that would be even better.
Great, thank you,
I
Charlie.
was just going to say, what I think is important out there now, if many of us have been working together for a long time with our environmental and community partners, and, you know, it's great that we've broken down a lot of these silos and that we're able to work together. And, you know, now I hear more and more the Sierra Club and some of these other groups that are out there that they're actually saying, you know, it's great that we want to fight for clean air and clean water and a safe and healthy environment. But we also need to make sure that there's good quality jobs for our children and our grandchildren as well. It's all part of the same scope here, that we have to fight for all of this together.
Great, Bob. Ashley, do you want to respond to that one too?
Yeah, sure. So one of the policy priorities that we're trying to advance is the Thrive agenda, which I know, you know, many people have signed on to, but we definitely don't really feel like that is, you know, enough, quite frankly. We're really excited about Congresswoman Cori Bush's vision for a Green New Deal, because she is centering Black voices and Indigenous sovereignty. And we just really cannot impart the need to make sure that this just transition really ensures that those people who are most impacted are directly at the decision-making table. And so we're really excited to see some of the things coming out of Representative Cori Bush's office.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley. We still have a few minutes, and we have a direct question to you, Charlie. If you could repeat the 6 points that you named towards the end of your presentation.
Sure. So yeah, so I guess, you know, for example, my union, we're not the building trades union, so we don't build anything. We manufacture, petrochemical products and gasolines. So the number one list would be a job that's like in kind to respect to duties. So um, a lot of our guys, we're operators. So, we do what Homer Simpson does. We run control rooms and we make sure that everything's on spec, that everything's running right. So something similar to that, to those duties. Two, comparable pay and benefits. That's one of the bigger things, right? We don't want to go from a $100,000 averaging job to a $40,000 job. There's room for discussion there too, right? We don't want to come off as greedy people, but if we are barely at the cusp of the lower tier of middle class, we want to kind of stay there. You don't want to go down. Three, union tenure. Like I said, we're not a trades union, but if we were to go and merge with another union, just throwing that out there, right? We don't want to start as an apprentice. We want some union tenure. Wage gap insurance. If we don't find a job, maybe there's a resolution where the employer that laid us off, will give us that wage gap insurance and supplement that, make us whole until we find something. 5, protecting our pensions and 401ks. That's one of my biggest fears, is that if there is a transition, this will be the opportunity for companies to get away with our pensions and 401ks and just disappear. And then obviously number 6, similar health benefits, whether it's HMO, PPO, or whatever, it doesn't matter. I mean, we just want health benefits that want to be taken care of.
Great. Thank you for that, Charlie. Okay. This might be a good closing thought here. Ashley, this was directed to you. Can you talk about working with people who may not share your priorities? What advice do you have?
Yeah, for sure. So I was actually a statewide candidate for office in the environmental agency, which is called the Oklahoma Corporation Commission in 2018. And so I actually was able to accrue a lot of Republican so-called right perspectives who were really, really supporting me. And so I think, one of the best strategies is to really keep your eyes on the prize. And for me, we can discuss all these other issues after we make sure that we have, a world for our future generations to even have these discussions. And so one of the big issues in Oklahoma is that eminent domain, which is really that taking away and stripping away of people's consent. And that's something that, of course, Indigenous people know very well is problematic, but other people in Oklahoma are beginning to realize that they're being impacted by this too. And this is just another form of colonization. And so really bringing people around, that prize, which is making sure that we have clean land, that these companies are actually consulting with the people who are being directly impacted, is so important. So just returning back to that local perspective. And honestly, showing up to those spaces is crucial. And I think, coming around issues like water, land, eminent domain are really great forays into making sure that these conversations are on the right path. And so that's been my experience in forming some very unlikely alliances here in my red state.
Terrific. And that pretty much brings us to time for our briefing. Again, thank you so much to all of our presenters today. Thank you to the authors of the report who did a terrific job in pulling all of that together. But it's really just, it's an amazing thing. And we saw in the chat box, I think it was Colin who pointed out, just hearing the perspectives from you all on the ground who are dealing with this on a daily basis. That really should be the foundation of how we're developing policies and programs to address not just transition, but all of our economic priorities and environmental priorities as we move forward. So thank you everybody for joining us. There were a number of things that were put in the chat box, links and things like that we will forward out to you. All of you who registered, you'll get more information from us. And please stay tuned to our website as the Just Transition Listening Project progresses. And we look forward to being in touch with you, and feel free to use us all as a resource as you continue moving forward on your work. So thank you all again, everybody, and to our sponsors, and we look forward to seeing you all again down the line.